Good evening, and welcome to CITI Media Reporter. I'm Howard Hominoff. Thank you for joining us this evening. My guest is Linda Ong, a veteran of the media business and a CEO of a company called Truthco, which we're going to learn more about tonight. Linda, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm going to take it right from the horse's mouth. Your site defines Truthco, if I have this right, as an independent brand consultancy developing culturally relevant insights for brands, companies, and nonprofits. So what's a culturally relevant insight?
Well, let me ask you this.
Okay.
I'll do an experiment that I've been doing lately. So close your eyes and describe for me, close your eyes.
All right.
Describe for me what a billionaire looks like.
Tall, handsome, very expensive suit.
Okay, about what age?
47.
Okay, so now you may open your eyes.
All right.
So if I asked a millennial that question, they would probably describe someone who was in a hoodie with some sneakers and jeans and looked a lot like Mark Zuckerberg. So cultural insight is really about recognizing that relevance is subjective and that relevance shifts over time. So what we do is analyze, in this case, how the idea of what a billionaire looks like and how that presents itself is actually shifting in our culture right now.
And how do you, what's an example of how you would work sort of on a practical basis with your clients? What is it, you can take me through, hey Linda, I got a problem, help me.
Sure.
And then, what is it that you're doing and what do you do when you get back together?
Right, that's a great question. Well, most of our clients come to us because they understand that the world is changing, and a lot of the traditional media companies are having to navigate with audiences that are declining or getting older or both, and having to make their content and their brand offering relevant for a younger and growing audience. And very often, as the billionaire example shows you, the cues and codes are very different. So if you want to demonstrate that you are in touch with a certain audience, you have to really recognize how they communicate. And culture, we just define as the shared knowledge of any society. It can be a micro subculture or it could be a foreign culture like another country. But you have to understand, if you want to demonstrate your relevance in a society, what other cues and codes are contextually going to be evaluated against your messaging.
How much does the client have to know about kind of where they're looking, for the the cultural relevance,
Right.
or how much is it you helping them know where to
Right.
look besides what
Right.
you actually find?
Well, it's both,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah,
Sometimes we have clients who say, look, we want to be relevant to millennials or Hispanics or specific, or even a psychographic. Like, we want to be a brand that stands for adventure. So understanding what the client's goals are, we can do a couple of things. Sometimes the first step we take, if it's an existing brand or a mature brand, is very often we will do an analysis and look at sort of the cultural sentiment of where that brand or that content lives vis-a-vis everything else that's going on in mass media. So what we find sometimes is where a client thinks they are, where they live in culture, and where they actually are perceived to live in culture are sometimes two very different things. So what we can do is, by really understanding what all the conversations are that are going on and where brands and content lives in that world, we can help them either cement where they are. Let's say they want to be seen as very cutting edge. Cutting edge is something that is not static, right? Cutting edge is continually, there's something new, and that's about keeping up. Or it could be about changing their place in culture. So a brand that maybe is seen as kind of outdated maybe wants to be seen as something fresher, but maybe they still want to stand for the same values. We can help them articulate how that happens.
And how do you distinguish between, and maybe it's not a distinguishing, but how I'll say with the word distinguish. How do you distinguish between what's popular, but not necessarily, and first you got to measure now what it means to be popular,
Right.
but taking popular to that's really relevant for us,
Right.
for me, for my brand, for my company, for my show, whatever it is. How do you make the
Right.
distinction and not just go with this
what's
is hot, so
popular. Right.
that's on top of culture right now.
Well, this is actually one of the most challenging questions in the television business today, because traditionally the metric of popularity, which was ratings, right, was an indicator to us of quality, because when we didn't have a lot of outlets, we didn't have a lot of choices, whatever more people gravitated to was perceived to be the best. But now we see actually the inverse is true in many cases. So in many cases, the thing that is getting the highest ratings is not what culturally is being lauded as being influential or important. So I'll give you an example. So the highest rated drama consistently on broadcast television is NCIS. Great show, high quality, but not a show that you're going to go to a cocktail party and everyone's going to be talking about. Now, it gets great ratings. It does a great job for CBS, but it's something that exists sort of in the background of culture, as opposed to a show like Girls, for example, on HBO, which Lena Dunham has become a figure of great cultural influence and importance. Girls was just one of the things that she's doing. It doesn't get anywhere near the ratings of NCIS, but her influence is felt throughout many industries, because she's become an icon and a voice for a new kind of femininity and a new way of representing women. So she's very influential. So the first step, I think, is exactly as you identified, which is isolate that popularity and influence are two separate things. Cultural success right now, what we see as, and we define that as really, in lay terms, being able to go to a cocktail party and say, hey, did you hear about this? That's something that's culturally successful. Even if people haven't experienced it firsthand, they know it's something that is animating conversation today. Whereas something that is just numerically popular is now necessarily regarded, with all this choice, as maybe something that is of lower quality. So for example, if you I'll just say probably generic toilet paper may outsell more premium branded toilet paper, but it doesn't mean it's better. It just means it's more accessible. Same thing is now happening in content.
So do different, I would assume that different clients have, on that scale, kind of popular, but not so buzzworthy,
Right.
super buzzworthy, but it doesn't have to be that popular. The
Right.
people are all on, the clients may fall in a whole bunch of different places on that spectrum.
Yeah.
Not everybody wants to be in the Lena Dunham business,
Exactly.
and not everybody, certainly CBS wants to be in the
Right.
NCIS business,
Right.
Even though it's, at on the Upper West Side, people we're not chatting about
Exactly.
it. But,
Well, and that's the spectrum. I think
Yeah.
you've identified a great spectrum, which is, CBS on one end has decided that their business is really going to be about mass, right, and getting as many people as they can. And Lena Dunham and HBO, of course, have been, they want to be cultural influencers, right? So everybody in the middle is confused.
Yeah.
Because their business models are wired to lean towards ratings. But what they're seeing is today, especially for new shows and new brands, it's very difficult to get any kind of mass until you have cultural influence. Part of that, again, is because there's such an abundance and infinite amount of content that people really don't have the time to sample. And so you're seeing, even the context of time has really radically shifted in this new digital paradigm, where we used to say TV was a time waster. And now we don't have enough time to watch all the good TV that's on our DVRs, that's on our queues. We never humanly will be able to consume all the stuff we're hearing about. So we now rely on culture, which can be mass media, social media, our friends, to help us define what has cred that's worth my time. Right? It's sort of like we're using a filter of culture to determine, I've only got an hour to watch TV. What's the best use of my time? Because I don't want to waste it. So I'm not going to take a chance, or even if I do take a chance on a show that I haven't heard anything about, my tendency to switch out is going to be, my tolerance for boredom is going to be very low. So if I watch the first, we've heard about the first 5 seconds of a commercial. If I watch the first 5 minutes of a TV show, and I know nothing about it, that first 5 minutes has to really deliver to keep me there for the hour.
So are we heading to a place where, the audiences, the audience and platforms are fragmenting.
Mm-hmm.
So many choices, as you talked about, right, that we can't all keep up with it. Are we heading to the place where there really isn't any mass? That it's all, the business is, even when you're a big company, is just a collection of, with CBS kind of, and
Right.
I don't want to be unfair to CBS, but is
Right.
CBS sort of that model, sort of the dinosaur
Right.
that you can't any or won't anymore create mass at all? It's all just putting together a whole bunch of niches to make my business? Or is there still some ability for the foreseeable future to accumulate enough mass to have a mass business?
Well, that's a great question. I wish I had the answer to that. I don't have it. I think what's happening right now is we're seeing a path towards further personalization, further customization, which means further nicheification of content. However, that said, at a certain point, that just becomes overwhelming for just the human brain to process. And what we see, actually, the benefit right now of brands is to be tastemakers. So, we've heard the curation aspect of brands, which they do, but I think what people are increasingly looking to brands to do is not just put things together, but put things together that matter in culture. And that's, I think, where some of that aggregation is going to happen. So people looking at, it traditionally used to be by demographic, right, and niche marketing. And what we see happening is that the pie is sort of blowing up, and it's much more about ecosystems, and whoever can envision and harness and bring together those ecosystems of different interests, maybe more psychographically than demographically driven, they have the ability to harness some mass. So it's probably, the pendulum will shift. Some of this is a reaction to just the abundance of content and how difficult it is to find things, and our dependence on people to sort of lead us and show us where the good stuff is. But I think at a certain point, that'll need to sort of aggregate more formally, and then, perhaps it becomes like the new kind of network.
Right. So, tell me a little bit of the science of this. Mm-hmm. How you, both, because there's science and art here.
Yeah.
So what do you use? What are the ingredients, that go into the science stew, and then where does the art part of it come in?
So we use a methodology based on semiotics and semiotic analysis. And semiotics is the study of meaning, how things acquire meaning in culture. So what we're really looking at are codes and cues that are put off everywhere, but most especially by media. So if you see a person on TV, the way they're styled, the way that they're presented to you, the graphics, the set, everything says something. Is this someone who is supposed to be an accessible person? Is this somebody who's supposed to be a fringe kind of character? We read all these things by the way that it's presented. Even the music gives us cues. Is this supposed to be something contemporary? Is this supposed to be something retro? So we have a team of trained analysts who understand all these codes and cues in our culture, so that if you see something, it typically means something. I'll give you a great example. So just even a pattern like camouflage that you go out in the street and you see a lot of people wearing, right? It's very popular now, right now to wear camouflage clothing. It's a fashion item, but it's also an everyday kind of thing for a lot of people. Well, it used to be that you would only see that on people who were actually going hunting. But now in our country, camouflage has come to symbolize a kind of Americanness. It's almost like stars and stripes. It's a way of saying that I live in America. It's not like you go all over the world and you see entire cultures wearing camo. It would look weird, it would look military. But in the US, it's very normal. So those kinds of codes and cues are a way of saying I belong to this tribe, or this is sort of a way of life that I embrace, even if these people aren't, going hunting.
Right.
So we look at codes and cues. Media and entertainment are full of codes and cues. Every time a show airs, you can have a plot and characters or a storyline, but the meaning of the show may be something that in many cases even may be different than what you're seeing. So I'll give you an example. Before the economic collapse, Real Housewives on Bravo was an amazing and fresh series. It was the first time we got to see what it was like to live like a millionaire and have amazing houses and cars and clothes. After the collapse, they're still in all those trappings, those visual trappings, but because of the cultural context, and now that we know that the economy has made it really difficult for people, we actually look at those things a little bit different. They've changed their meaning in that sometimes it's excessive, sometimes it's insensitive, and we also even see a different storyline emerging that feels more culturally relevant when the wives are all having to work, the husbands are going through issues, they're going through jail or having financial difficulties, there's suicide. So we're seeing a different side of the Real Housewives that only makes sense because of the times we live in. And so that show changed its meaning in our culture.
And these kinds of insights, are they, how do they come about? Do they come about through a type of, there's a consensus around it in a kind of, scientific or sociological research way? So, for example, the camouflage kind of Americana link. Right. Where does that come from? Is it something that over a long period of time? It was an event that created, Madonna wore camouflage and then it became a thing? How? And there probably isn't one answer to that, but how do you know that how relevant those insights are going to be, so that your client isn't saying, well, that's interesting, but how do I know that? It could be, could be just that there's now really an obsession around hunting. Right.
So because if we look at culture as defined as the shared knowledge of a society, what we now have because of the internet is the availability to see what society is actually saying, whether it's television, books, internet, film, mass media of any kind, newspapers, magazines, radio, mobile apps, social media, advertising, and then you have the arts. You have, fine art, performance, dance, music, and all of these things talk to each other. They're all responding and commenting on what's going on in society. So what we do is when we have an assignment, we look at a specific either aspect of culture or look at all of culture through a specific lens, the brand or the audience. And we look at how they're talking about, we analyze how they're talking about these things. How are they using these things? And what happens is when you start to see patterns, right? Humans love to recognize patterns, and culture is also about patterns. So what we're just looking at is how we can see how one idea can be used and adopted in many, many different ways, not just we're not looking at fads, because we're also looking at, so example, in the country music space, we used to always remember that if a guy wore a cowboy hat, he was a country music star. But today, that is a traditional view of a country music star. Today, they might wear a beanie cap or a trucker cap to say they're a new kind of country music star. So you can visually, you can see this, you can read articles about it, you can see postings and see how people are representing what kind of image it is really about their own personal brands and how they put it forward, and then how it's talked about in culture. Is this being seen as a new thing? Is this being seen as a traditional thing? And how do those ideas travel from one publication to another to social media? So it is really, to your question about is it, set off by events? Sometimes the economic collapse changed everybody's perspective. And it wasn't, but it's not one thing. It's that everybody started saying, hey, what's going on? Hey, what's going on with Wall Street? What's going on? And we started questioning all these things. And what it takes is, influential voices who, very often if you're reading an article, say in the New York Times, they may reference an article that was in the New Yorker, and they may reference something that was from some other publication or some other media outlet. So you can see how people take ideas and adopt them and run with them. And some of that is quantitative, but much more of it is qualitative, because all voices are not equal, especially on social media. Some people can have a lot of followers, not necessarily influential in culture. So it's really about understanding who's really articulating ideology that people are gravitating to.
So I'm going to ask you for two examples, okay? Mm-hmm. They can be clients, or one of them I suspect will definitely not be a client. But give me a good example and a bad example of sort of applying lessons of the culture for people in TV.
Okay.
Maybe, and it might be somebody you specifically worked with or not, but just, again, sort of in that concretely, who's good and bad, examples of
Right. Well, I'm not going to name clients.
You don't have to. No, and especially in the bad, I figured you would
no,
not. But
I would
just
say,
where you see
okay,
things that.
so I will say we do a lot of work with the Hispanic audience, right? And I think there's a lot of color and dimension and differentiation within that audience. And I think that one of the things that we try to do is help people get beyond sort of easy but inactionable facts. So, for example, we've all seen statistics that say Hispanics are very religious, right? So, an example of what not to do with that would be to make shows about the Pope or saints. That's not what they want. But from a cultural insights perspective, we would say that background in religion has been the backbone for many things that have implications for the entertainment world. So, for example, growing up in the church exposed that audience to pageantry and a lot of mystery and a lot of melodrama. So those kinds of shows have great appeal. Spectacle, fireworks. You know, people think that a lot of Hispanic shows are gaudy, but if you understand that they come from a tradition in the church that was very rich in that pageantry and that fantastic exploration and celebration of life, you understand that these things kind of translate into a love of entertainment, beauty pageants, for example. But so I think what we try to do is say, understand why people are responding the way they do in a focus group or a quant survey, but don't just do the sort of surface. I think the biggest challenge that we have is people always want us to tell them what to do.
Right.
And we really have to fight, because what we actually, to your question, what we feel the biggest way to fail is to just do. If you have to understand how people think. So for my religion example, if you understand that being religious means you have a different way of growing up, or a specific way of growing up. Family is really important, because Sunday was always the day you went to church, and then you all had a big meal together, and being together with family is important to everybody, but family in a Hispanic context is about being physically together all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So understanding those nuances, I think, is what the difference is between our insights, and I think the where it would be wrong is just to take tactics away from it, because then that becomes and then it's like, well, we tried the shows about popes and then nobody watched them, so they're not it. So they don't do that. It's like, so that's what I would say is to, I think what we try to do is help clients achieve a cultural fluency. So it's not just about visiting this culture, but living in it and thinking like it.
So I'm going to shift. I'll ask you a somewhat personal question.
Okay, go for it.
You indicated on your website
Yes.
that the program that made you fall in love with television, Winky Dink and You.
Love it.
All right. What is Winky Dink and You? I don't remember Winky Dink
Google
and You, and why was that? Why did that? Even more important, the why. Why did it have such an impact?
Winky Dink and You is and was the first interactive television show ever created.
And was
it
that
was
was
19?
that,
I'm
was
going
that
to say
was that a local
no. It was
or
a national show,
Okay.
and I believe, I would say it was like 1969-ish that I recall. It was a black and white cartoon. It was a children's Saturday morning show, as I recall. What was cool about it is your mom had to go to the store and buy a kit, and in this kit was this very unwieldy piece of plastic that you had to unroll and actually put on the television screen, and you also got a set of crayons. And Winky Dink was this little stick figure animated character who would get in all kinds of precarious incidents, situations that you as the viewer had to bail him out of. So for example, he would be on a cliff and his boat would be sailing away, and he'd say, help me, and you'd have to draw a rope with your crayon to the boat to pull it back. Now, I just thought this was amazing, because it was the first time that I'd ever experienced that you could interact with your TV. Winky Dink, the rumor is that Winky Dink failed horribly because children started just writing on their
I was
TVs.
just going to say probably a lot
That
of
was
ruined
not good.
TVs.
Yeah, and then probably
That's it.
like permanent markers and
Right,
stuff like
yeah.
that. Also, then there was like they didn't want the kids too close to the tube and all that.
Right.
But I actually think a lot of the principles that were in Winky Dink and You were used very successfully decades later by Blue's Clues, which was asking the audience to help solve a problem. In that case, it was usually verbal or they had to do something. But it was very much the same idea, which is using children's imagination to help solve problems. And so that's what I've been doing all my life.
So let's shift from the past to the future.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of what you're describing is today
Right.
is not as much television.
Right.
Some of it's television, but much more online. We've got
Yeah.
apps, we've got phone, we've got devices that, that kids at very early ages play with. What's your feel, and what are you hearing from your clients also in terms of talking about the future of television and,
Right.
and in that world where so much cultural relevance is coming from places other than
Yeah.
TV?
Well, I think what's interesting is what I'm hearing from my clients and what we're seeing in the world tend to be two different things. We have a
Okay.
study actually that we did really designed to help translate what's going on in the outside world to traditional media companies. But really what we see is happening is that there's really been an upending of the traditional relationship between viewers and media companies, in that viewers used to be the end recipients, the end users of content. And so when there weren't a lot of choices, media companies could make things, do a big brand or marketing campaign and say, watch this. And it's not just media companies, Pepsi told us we were the Pepsi generation. Coke told us they were it, and people either bought it or they didn't. But that was the traditional mode of interacting with culture, was really one way. And now what we see because of digital is the paradigm's completely inverted, and you've got consumers who are essentially grazing across different platforms, different brands, different kinds of content, assembling their own kind of virtual networks. And so in that regard, the consumer is now the CEO of their own content. And they are programming, they're marketing, they're distributing, they're commenting in social media, they're reviewing, they're often doing the advertising with the advertisers. They're doing every function that a traditional television network used to do. And so in that paradigm shift, the TV networks and all the content creators and media companies are essentially suppliers to the CEO of content. And so part of the shift that networks need to make and media companies need to make to be successful is to understand that they're in the service business now. They're not in the product business, and it's very different. You have to be in a conversation. The relationship between consumers and content has fundamentally changed, and content serves the consumer's end, not the other way around.
And we'll see how it all plays out, Linda. This has flown by, but thank you very much for
Great.
joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us this evening on CITI Media Reporter. I'm Howard Hominoff. Good night.